We were taught all our lives that the great fires of the 19th century were accidents, that somewhere a kerosene lamp was knocked over, elsewhere imperfect materials ignited from an ordinary spark. But you were misled, because once you strip away the propagandistic gloss of school textbooks, it becomes apparent that the fires in these cities behaved far too selectively. They did not destroy chaotically. Rather, they seemed to burn away precisely what did not fit into a new vision of the world. And the deeper I delved into the archives, the more insistently a question arose. What exactly needed to be erased from the face of the earth before history could be rewritten anew? Look at the photographs taken immediately after those disasters. Stone buildings with massive arches and windows as tall as three-story houses stand almost untouched, while around them lies a desolate plain of burned-out neighborhoods. Isn't it strange that, according to the official version, the fire moved at the speed of a storm, yet bypassed heavy structures, as if it understood that they were not so easy to bring down? For some reason, it was precisely those buildings that resembled architecture far older than historians claimed that were later declared unsafe and almost immediately demolished. What were these walls hiding? And who could have built such structures if, in the 19th century, according to experts, the population of many regions barely reached a few 100,000 people? In the archives, I found a description of an inventory conducted immediately after one of the largest fires. The document claimed that nearly two-thirds of the city had burned down, although satellite reconstructions, yes, such models exist today, show that the affected area was larger than what official reports indicated. Why were the real scales downplayed? And why do modern researchers avoid discussing a discrepancy equal to the difference between an ordinary disaster and something resembling a deliberate clearing operation? Look at the development maps. Many plots after the fire appear perfectly level, as if the ground had been prepared in advance. Fire spreads chaotically, but the ideal geometry of scorched space tells a very different story. And by the way, notice how little time it took for the cities to recover, just a few years. Yet according to official statistics, those regions at the time lacked labor, materials, and equipment. How, then, were dozens of buildings with monolithic columns, complex ceiling structures, and facades requiring highly skilled craftsmen constructed? Explanations like, "That's just how they built back then," stop working when you look at the census data. In some cities, the number of residents doubled immediately after the fire, even though no large-scale migrations were recorded during that period. Where did these people come from? And why were the documents registering newcomers filed in the archives later than they should have been? No matter how much I studied reports, diagrams, maps, and the few surviving eyewitness accounts, the overall picture pointed to one thing. The official version does not withstand even basic logic. The timelines do not match, the scale of the work does not add up, and the origin of buildings that, by a fortunate coincidence, survived long enough to be demolished later without the need for a fire, under the pretext of modernization, remains unexplained. Most importantly, these fires somehow occurred precisely where the most complex and most monumental structures of the so-called old type stood. They disappeared first. The flames seemed to burn not streets, but the memory of what had existed before us. When I began comparing the dates of these events, a disturbing pattern emerged. Almost every few decades, a major catastrophe occurred, destroying traces of a civilization whose architecture was far too advanced for the conditions of the 19th century, too sophisticated to have been built by people with limited technology and scarce resources. While historians speak of coincidences, I see something entirely different, a plan carried out carefully, consistently, and remarkably efficiently. If this is coincidence, it is too perfect. If this is chance, it is far too beneficial to those who rewrote history. Once you start viewing the great fires of the 19th century not as natural disasters, but as part of a large historical mechanism, many details suddenly take on a frightening clarity. For example, consider the descriptions of the temperatures that buildings were supposedly exposed to during these catastrophes. Reports speak of heat that melted metal structures and shattered glass within minutes. But the officially recognized temperature of an urban fire never rises to the level at which stone and metal begin to deform. To produce such effects, heat comparable to that of an industrial furnace would be required. Where could such heat have come from in neighborhoods built primarily of wooden houses with minimal amounts of fuel? Historians usually avoid this question, yet it is far too significant to be ignored. I found archival eyewitness descriptions claiming that the fire moved unlike ordinary flames. It did not simply spread with the wind. It seemed to advance along a specific line. There is one firefighter's testimony that is especially unsettling. He wrote that the street they were moving along had already been burned down to a flat, ashen layer, even though just a few hours earlier stone-built houses had stood there. Stone houses, he emphasized, could not have burned so quickly or so evenly. If this had been written by just one person, it could be dismissed as an emotional outburst. But there are dozens of such testimonies, far too many to be explained away as coincidence. Let us turn to statistics. In one of the most severely affected cities, stone buildings made up roughly 1/5 of the total development. Yet after the fire, only about 1/10 of that portion remained. How can it be explained that a material resistant to fire disappeared almost as quickly as wood? In the reports, this anomaly is attributed to explosions allegedly occurring in basements. But when you study building plans, it becomes clear that many of these houses simply had no spaces where large quantities of combustible materials could have been stored. At the same time, almost all of them had thick walls, arched passages, and foundations extending deeper into the ground than construction standards of the time required. Why would an ordinary urban building need a foundation comparable to those used in fortifications or industrial facilities? Now look at the utility maps. Prior to many of the fires, cities underwent infrastructure modernization operations. This involved the removal of certain old pipelines, the elimination of unknown underground passages, and the sealing off of several basement levels. What today are called engineering levels were once ordinary underground floors. Yet official history claims that these levels were incomplete or had been naturally filled in. However, photographs of exposed utility lines show carefully leveled walls, tool marks, and even sections of interior cladding. How could a natural process create such precise architecture? When you view all of this as a whole, the conclusion becomes clear. The fire was the final stage of the operation. First, a clearing was carried out beneath the city, then the old structures were destroyed, and only after that did the rewriting of history begin. Those who asked too many questions were sent to committees, commissions, and institutes, where they were gently but persistently told that their observations did not fit within academic methodology. Yet, that very methodology was created after the old world had disappeared. It was a tool used to construct a new narrative, convenient, coherent, and free of explosive questions. Most telling of all is the reaction of the authorities after the fires. They acted too quickly and too systematically. Within just a few weeks, planning for new development began, despite a lack of resources and a population that was still disoriented. And yet the new projects looked as if they had been designed long before the catastrophe. They were too logical, too carefully thought out, too convenient for control. Wide streets appeared, symmetrical blocks, administrative buildings constructed in a style that would later be called imperial or state-driven. The traces of the old world vanished, sometimes literally overnight. And here is the main question that brings us back to the starting point. Who benefited from burning the evidence? Who had the resources, the power, and the technology to carry out such operations across vast territories? And why do all these catastrophes so strangely coincide with the beginning of the period historians call the Industrial Age? Or perhaps the Industrial Age was not a beginning, but a reset? Imagine this. In the mid-19th century, across enormous areas of Eurasia and North America, there stood architecture that simply did not correspond to the technological level of its time. Monumental facades, colonnades as tall as 5-story buildings, tunnels descending deeper into the ground than the building regulations of the era allowed. And then, within just a few decades, waves of fires swept through these cities, each one seeming like the final stage of a large-scale clearing operation. The official narrative speaks of tragic coincidences, but look at the mathematics. The probability that such events would occur consecutively in several major cities within a span of only a few decades approaches zero. And the more you study this statistic, the stronger the sense becomes that fire was not an enemy, but a tool. But the most incredible part begins not before, but after the fires. In one city, I examined a population census conducted just 3 years after the catastrophe. And this is what shocked me. The population had grown by almost 50%, even though migration reports listed only a few thousand arrivals. How is that possible? Even with an extraordinarily high birth rate, such a jump is impossible. Either the censuses were rewritten, or people were brought in an organized, massive way, using transport convoys prepared in advance. But where are the documents? Where are the registration logs? Where are the traces of all this logistics? They are not there. As if someone wanted this stretch of history to remain invisible, collapsed, empty. And it is precisely in this emptiness that the key question arises. If people were indeed brought in, then for what purpose? To populate territories from which the traces of a previous civilization had just vanished. To form a new population that had never seen what once stood there. To create a generation with no knowledge and no memory of the technologies that existed before. A century is long enough to erase memory, but not long enough to erase stone walls. That is why the walls had to be burned. Look at the photographs taken after the fires. In many places, vast deserts of leveled ground remain, without a single stone block in sight. But stone does not simply disappear. If it is not cut apart, removed, or hidden, it stays where it is. And yet it vanished, as if entire structures had simply dissolved. But if we accept that dismantling operations were already carried out before the fire, everything falls into place. The fire did not destroy the buildings. The fire destroyed the traces of dismantling. It was a smokescreen concealing a far more precise, engineering-intensive operation. I found a report from a commission formed immediately after the city was rebuilt. It stated that a number of old structures did not meet modern requirements and were subject to urgent demolition. The strangest part is that the commission listed the exact number of buildings that supposedly had to be dismantled. The problem is that many of those buildings no longer existed after the fire. In other words, the list had been prepared in advance. And if such lists existed in one city, how likely is it that they did not exist elsewhere? Now consider another detail. In several cities, there is testimony that the fire spread faster than physically possible. In one case, the distance between two neighborhoods was about 1 kilometer. Only minutes passed between the outbreaks of fire. The official explanation was strong wind. But even with very strong wind, flames need time to engulf dense urban development. Unless the fires appeared simultaneously in multiple locations. Unless it was a series of targeted arsons carried out in an organized manner. Arsons aimed at specific types of structures. The strangest, the oldest, the most inconvenient for the new version of the past. And here comes the culmination. When you look at these cities before and after the fires, you get the feeling that the world did not experience destruction, but a reset. As if the old era did not end on its own, but was deliberately brought to an end by someone who decided to erase the past and start everything from a clean slate. People as a new population. The city as a new stage. History as a new book. But if the world was truly reset, then who pressed the button? When I first compared the dates of several of the largest fires, their chronology struck me. In different parts of the planet, from North American cities to territories stretching between the Baltic and the Black Sea, the blows came almost in waves. The intervals between them seemed carefully calibrated. On average, about 10 to 15 years. As if someone were carrying out a large-scale operation region by region, unhurried, yet methodical, as if peeling away the upper layers of an unwanted past. Official history explains this period by the underdevelopment of firefighting technologies. But that explanation sounds strange when you see that the catastrophes occurred not chaotically, but with astonishing regularity. Now imagine this. In the cities already stood architecture from a previous era, too perfect, too massive, too technologically advanced for the level of development that historians attribute to the mid-19th century. And alongside it, a young industrial age just beginning to gain momentum. The old system, whether real or imagined, became inconvenient. It had to be concealed because it did not fit into the new ideological framework. The clearing began. But here's the strange part. The fire did not destroy everything indiscriminately. It burned precisely those areas where architectural anomalies were concentrated. Those buildings that went beyond standard construction technology. Those structures that later no one could logically explain in terms of construction dates, labor resources, or materials. In several archives, I came across descriptions of so-called zones of abnormal intensity. These were places where the flames seemed to erupt from within, rather than spread from the outside. And this is important to emphasize. This is a figurative description, but it is based on real eyewitness quotes pointing to explosions, flashes, and the instantaneous collapse of load-bearing columns. What does this resemble? Not a natural fire, but something more precise, more controlled. As if the goal was not to burn the city, but to destroy specific technologies hidden inside buildings whose layouts were far from simple. But where did those technologies go? Where are the traces of tools, diagrams, and blueprints? Why, in the rebuilt cities, was there not a single artifact that would testify to a high technical level of the past? And here a detail appears that is difficult to ignore. In almost every city affected by such fires, within a couple of years after reconstruction, archival repositories were established, where documents discovered during the clearing process were collected. Yet almost all of these documents are, quite remarkably, dated to the period after the catastrophe, as if the world's previous paper memory had been replaced with a new one. And here one of the greatest paradoxes emerges. How could such cities arise immediately after the fires? Within just a few years, administrative buildings, railway stations, theaters, and schools appeared, built in a unified style, as if they were overseen by the same central authority. This resembles a situation in which an old system is destroyed and a new one is erected in its place, simplified and adapted to the coming industrial age. The city became a factory, the population a workforce, and history an instrument, standardized like a mathematics textbook. But there is one more detail that forced me to look at everything from a different angle. In several cities after the fires, plots of land were found where traces of buildings extended downward, entire floors, 5 to 7 meters below the current ground level. Officially, this is explained as the accumulation of a cultural layer or the natural rise of ground level. But these explanations align suspiciously well with what happened before the fires. Many basement levels had been deliberately filled in beforehand, as if old floors were meant to disappear from sight even before the city burned. Taken together, all of this forms one frighteningly coherent sequence. The clearing of underground levels, the dismantling of selected building elements, the removal of materials, then a fire that erased all traces of preparation, and finally rapid reconstruction according to new rules. As if someone did not want to destroy the cities, but rather to destroy the past that those cities preserved. And here the main question grows ever louder. If fire was not an accident, but the final stroke of an operation, then what exactly were they trying to conceal? What knowledge, what devices, what evidence that our civilization is not the first, and perhaps not the most advanced? And if this is so, then the great fires were not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a new era, created like a world assembled anew, where memory was reformatted and history rewritten. So let us imagine the final picture. The 19th century approaches its midpoint, and the old world seems to begin cracking at the seams. Monumental buildings, rooted in a much deeper past, no longer fit into the new reality. The industrial era is preparing to begin, but it cannot start while structures still stand in the streets that appear to have been created by people who followed entirely different principles of construction. The technologies of the old world, real or presumed, interfere with the new era becoming self-sufficient. And that is when what we now call the Great Fires are set in motion. But here is the key point. If everything really happened the way it appears in the reconstruction, then what exactly were they trying to erase? What knowledge could have changed our understanding of the past? In several reports compiled after the catastrophes, there are mentions of strange metal structures found beneath the ruins of buildings that were officially considered to be stone. These descriptions are extremely brief, almost fragmentary, as if the authors were afraid to say more than was permitted. They mention reinforcing ribs, unknown alloys, and components that could not be properly studied. And all of this disappears almost immediately. There are no photographs, no samples, as if this part of memory was carefully scrubbed away. Even if, within a fictional framework, we imagine that these could have been fragments of technologies from a previous civilization, the very fact that such discoveries vanished is already reason enough to pause and reflect. Another important detail is the demographic surges that occurred immediately after the fires. Imagine a city that lost a significant part of its infrastructure and population, and then, just a few years later, it fills with new people, as if they were deliberately directed to the cleared territory. In a narrative sense, this looks like the settlement of a new page of history. But even when viewed through the lens of real data, the question remains, why are migration flows so poorly documented? And why are their points of origin often unspecified? It feels as though the population was meant to appear rather than arrive, as if the new world was being created not only architecturally, but socially as well. Now imagine the philosophical dimension of the entire picture. If the world truly experienced something like a reset, even in an allegorical sense, then we are living on the surface of a layer beneath which lies another history, forgotten, burned away, or simply excluded from school curricula. And then the great fires cease to be tragedies and become boundaries, lines separating the old order from the new, borders between a reality we can confirm through documents and a reality we can only reconstruct. And if we think even deeper, a frightening yet captivating thought emerges. Perhaps our civilization is truly not the first, but merely the one that exists after a great cleansing. Perhaps we are a generation that was handed a new textbook, neatly bound and stripped of unnecessary chapters. History becomes like a giant whose memory was cut away so that it could learn to walk again. But if that is the case, then a question arises that cannot be ignored. What happens when memory begins to return? When more and more people start asking uncomfortable questions? When archives become more accessible? When analytical technologies allow us to peer into the deepest layers of cities? What will happen if it turns out that we are standing on the foundation of a reality about which we know almost nothing? That thought becomes the final bomb. The great fires of the 19th century, in an artistic reconstruction, appear as a global attempt to erase the old world and write a new one. But if our world has already been rewritten once, why should we not assume that it could happen again? And who, then, would be the ones to decide that it is time to press the reset button? Anyone who asks such questions is already stepping beyond the boundaries of the familiar narrative. And if you have followed this all the way to these lines, it means you are among those who are willing to look deeper than the official version allows. Share your thoughts, subscribe, because next we will continue this investigation, and perhaps together we can understand the most important thing of all: who stands behind those pages of history that were burned before we had the chance to read them.